Good morning, good afternoon, or good night to all our Sip&Talkers out there, wherever you are in this chaotic world. Welcome back to Sip&Talk. I am the guy sitting here with a lukewarm, dark roast, ready to either ruin your morning or, enlighten it. Probably a mix of both. I'm Joe.
And I'm the one sitting across from him trying to bring a little bit of warmth into the studio.
Yeah.
I'm Sunny. Seriously, did we not pay the heating bill? It feels like the AC is blasting in here.
It really is freezing, but hey, maybe that's just the universe setting the mood. Because we're about to step into some chilling territory.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
I was just thinking, usually we try to keep things a little bit lighter. Right? We talk about tech trends, maybe some pop culture, or why my coffee machine is definitely plotting against me.
Usually, yes. And usually I'm the one trying to bring the metaphorical energy drink, the stories that make you want to charge forward and conquer the day. But today feels different. It feels like we ordered the heavy meal, the kind of meal that sits in your stomach and might cause some serious indigestion if we don't chew it very, very slowly.
That is the perfect way to put it. We're looking at what feels like a glitch in the matrix today. We're going to connect three narratives that seem totally separate on the surface, different times, different continents, but they are actually running on the exact same logic engine.
It really is a glitch, because when we look back at the Pacific World War II, 80 plus years ago, we use words like atrocity, national righteousness, and liberation. And we think those words belong in old black and white documentaries.
Right. They're history.
They're history. But then you fast forward to right now. You look at the battlefields in Ukraine right now, or you look ahead to the rising tension in the Taiwan Strait, and the vocabulary is identical. It's like civilization just hit copy-paste.
Exactly. And that brings us to the core thesis of today's conversation. We're exploring the idea that narrative is not an objective record of history. It isn't a dusty book on a shelf. It is a tool. It is a weapon, really, used to achieve specific political goals right now, in the present.
So to be clear for everyone listening, we aren't just reading history books today.
No way. We're reading the manual on how to dismantle and reassemble history to build a weapon. We've got a roadmap in 3 acts. Act 1, the past. We're going back to the Pacific War to see how war atrocities became these, nuclear-grade diplomatic weapons between China, Japan, and the U.S.
And Act 2 is the present. We're going to pull into the negotiation tables in Geneva and Abu Dhabi regarding the Russia-Ukraine war, which is now entering its 4th year in 2026. We need to see how the very definitions of peace are clashing and why they can't seem to agree on what reality even is.
And finally, Act 3, the future. Or rather, the looming future. We're looking at the Taiwan Strait and how the entire post-WWII order is being reinterpreted to legitimize potential action there.
It's a lot, I know, but it's so necessary. So grab your coffee. If you're like my friend here, you've got your coal-face roast ready to go.
Hey, it's acquiring a complex acidity as it cools, I swear.
I'll take your word for it. But listen, the big question we need you to keep in mind is this. If history is written by the winners, which book should those of us who just want a peaceful future actually read?
That is the million-dollar question. So let's start with the heaviest cornerstone, the narrative struggle of the WWII Pacific War.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's set the stage. We're not doing history class. I don't want to talk about specific treaty dates or troop movements unless they really matter to the story now. We are talking about soft power weaponry.
It reminds me of that argument we almost had earlier. I was about to go to war with you over the color of the pearls in our boba tea.
I still stand by my statement. Black pearls are superior to golden pearls. It's an aesthetic necessity. It's classic.
And I say golden pearls have a better texture and they look like little treasures. But the point is, even in something that silly, we both had a narrative. Yours was tradition and aesthetics. Mine was innovation and experience. Now imagine that dynamic, but the stakes aren't bubble tea. The stakes are national survival, global standing, and the legitimacy of your entire government.
Right. That's a whole different ballgame. Let's look at the Chinese Communist Party's narrative framework first. The core theme here is really specific. Resistance equals the starting point of national rejuvenation.
This is so crucial. For the CCP, their political legitimacy is tied directly to this story. The story goes that they were the ones who saved the nation from the brink of extinction. It's this simple equation. National suffering leads to national rejuvenation.
And they've actually tweaked the timeline to make this fit better. Have you noticed the shift to the 14-year war?
Yes, this is a fascinating piece of narrative engineering. For decades, the standard history books, both in China and globally, referred to the 8-year War of Resistance. That clock started in 1937 with the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which was the start of the full-scale total war.
Right, that's what I learned in school, 1937. But recently, officially, the Chinese Ministry of Education shifted the start date back to 1931.
All the way back to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Now, why does that 6-year difference matter? I mean, it seems like a minor detail, right? A historian's argument.
I assume it's just to make the suffering look longer, to emphasize the victimhood narrative.
That's definitely part of it, but it's so much more strategic than that. By extending the timeline back to 1931, it centers the whole narrative on the long-term struggle in the Northeast, in Manchuria. So you have to ask, who was active in the resistance in Manchuria during those really early years?
Well, it was mostly local guerrilla groups, right?
Exactly, local guerrilla groups, many of which had ties to communist organizers.
I see where this is going. Whereas in 1937, the major battles were fought by the nationalists, the KMT, under Chiang Kai-shek.
Precisely. If your clock starts in 1937, the KMT looks like the primary defender of the nation because they controlled the official army that fought the Battle of Shanghai, the Battle of Wuhan, and so on. But if you start in 1931, the CCP can claim a much longer, more consistent thread of resistance that predates the KMT's total war effort. It effectively marginalizes the KMT's role and centers the CCP as the absolute backbone of Chinese survival.
That is incredibly subtle, but so powerful. It completely changes the protagonist of the movie.
It does. And within this framework, things like the Nanjing Massacre, the Comfort Women issue, and especially Unit 731, they aren't just tragedies to be mourned. In this narrative, they are evidence. They are Exhibit A, B, and C in a permanent, never-ending trial against Japanese militarism.
Let's talk about Unit 731 for a second, because I think for some of our listeners, this might be a part of the history they're less familiar with. This is the Biological and Chemical Warfare Research Unit.
It's the darkest of the dark. I mean, we are talking about vivisections on live prisoners without anesthesia, testing frostbite by freezing and thawing people's limbs, testing bubonic plague bombs on entire villages. It is unspeakably horrific.
In the Chinese education system and in their memorial museums, this is presented as the ultimate proof of the inhumanity of the enemy they faced.
And by extension, the righteousness of their resistance. The logic is crystal clear. Look at what we were up against. Look at the pure evil we defeated. Therefore, our leadership is not just political, it is moral salvation.
And this becomes a diplomatic tool. We see this play out all the time, even now. Relations with Japan get a little rocky. Maybe a trade dispute, maybe a territorial issue over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, and then suddenly a Japanese prime minister visits the Yasukuni Shrine.
And boom, the history weapon is deployed. Instantly. The Chinese state media will immediately pivot to high-intensity historical criticism. It's not just, you visited a shrine, it's, you are honoring the spirits of the war criminals who operated Unit 731. It just shuts down any diplomatic maneuvering room. It forces Japan into a corner where they have to apologize rather than, say, negotiate on trade or territory.
But let's play devil's advocate here. Or rather, let's look for the blind spots. Because every single narrative has a blind spot. What isn't in this particular story?
Well, the elephant in the room is the Chinese Civil War. The neat, clean narrative of unity against the invader totally glosses over the intense power struggles between the CCP and the KMT during the war. I mean, there were times when they were fighting each other as much as, if not more than, they were fighting the Japanese.
And what about the destruction of history that happened later on?
That's the other huge blind spot. During the Cultural Revolution in the 60s and 70s, the Red Guards destroyed countless historical sites, ancient temples, books, and records. So the narrative is very, very selective. It amplifies the external enemy, Japan, to build this sense of national unity while completely silencing the internal destruction that happened later. It's a curated memory designed for stability.
So that's the view from Beijing. Very clear, very consistent. Now, let's pivot to Tokyo. Because Japan doesn't really have one story, does it? It feels like they're almost schizophrenic about this whole period.
Schizophrenic is a strong word, but yeah, in a way, Japan is fighting an internal history civil war. It's almost like a split personality disorder on a national scale.
Okay, so on one side you have the conservatives. Tell me about their logic. Because to a lot of our listeners, especially here in the West, the idea that Japan was a victim or a liberator in WWII sounds, frankly, insane.
It sounds insane to us because we read the orthodox history books, the ones where America is the hero. But let's try to step into their shoes for a second. The conservative view, and this includes powerful factions in the LDP, the ruling party, argues that the war was forced upon Japan by the international environment at the time.
You mean the oil embargoes?
The ABCD encirclement America, British, Chinese, Dutch. They argued that Japan, as a rising industrial power, was being systematically choked off from resources. They needed oil, rubber, steel, all of it, to survive as a modern nation. The Western powers controlled all the supply in Asia. So the argument goes, we didn't want war, but we had to fight to break the blockade.
And then there's the Asian liberation theory. This one always trips me up. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere.
Right, and the narrative is this. Look at Asia in 1940. India was British, Indochina was French, Indonesia was Dutch, the Philippines was American. Japan was the only non-white power standing up to centuries of Western imperialism.
So they frame the invasion of these countries as kicking out the colonizers.
Exactly. They say, we weren't invading Indonesia, we were liberating it from the Dutch. We weren't invading Vietnam, we were liberating it from the French. Now, obviously, the reality on the ground was that the Japanese occupation was often just as brutal, or sometimes even more so, than the Western colonial rule it replaced. But the narrative allows them to maintain a sense of national pride. We fought for Asia, not just for Japan.
And this is the group that tends to be very skeptical about the numbers, right? With things like the Nanjing massacre.
Very. They will argue endlessly about the exact death toll in Nanjing. They'll say, it wasn't 300,000, it was 30,000, and it was mostly combatants who refused to surrender. Or they'll argue about the definition of coercion regarding comfort women, claiming many were willing prostitutes. They treat history like a legal contract where they're trying to find loopholes to reduce their liability.
And what about Unit 731 in that narrative?
It's often blurred out or denied entirely by the extreme right wing. It's treated as unverified or exaggerated post-war propaganda in their preferred version of history.
But that's not the whole story in Japan. We can't paint them all with that same brush.
Absolutely not, and that's so important to remember. You have a very strong liberal and progressive movement in Japan, and they are totally different. They engage in deep, painful reflection. They are the strongest supporters of the Peace Constitution Article 9, which renounces war. They are the ones constantly criticizing militarism. There are Japanese civil groups that have spent decades demanding accountability for comfort women, even suing their own government on behalf of the victims. So when we say Japan's narrative, we really have to ask, which Japan are we talking about?
That brings us to the third player in this triangle, the United States. You'd think the U.S. would just have one simple story. We won, we were the good guys. But it's actually more complicated than that.
Much more. And the U.S. narrative, or rather narratives, directly shape Washington's policy in the Asia-Pacific to this day. There are really three main schools of thought here.
Okay, break them down for us.
First, you have the Orthodox school. This is the standard view you get in most high school textbooks. Japan was the clear aggressor. Pearl Harbor was unprovoked. The atomic bombs were a tragic but necessary tool to end the war and save lives, and the Tokyo trials were justice served. This is the good war narrative. Think of historians like Herbert Bix, who wrote Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan. It places the blame squarely on the emperor and the military clique.
Okay, that's the version most Americans are familiar with. What's the second school?
The second is the revisionist, or sometimes called the realist view. This one asks more uncomfortable questions. It looks at the U.S. role as an emerging imperial power in the Pacific at the time. It asks, did the U.S. oil embargo force Japan's hand? Was the U.S. just another empire competing for the same turf and resources? It contextualizes the war within the broader scope of racism and imperialism. John Dower's incredible book, War Without Mercy, really dives into this, looking at how race hatred on both sides fueled the extraordinary brutality of the Pacific War.
So it makes it less of a good versus evil story and more of a clash of empires story.
Exactly. And then you have the third one, which I think is the most relevant for our conversation today. The reconciliation or memory politics school. They don't just look at what happened. They focus on why we remember what we remember. And this is where the U.S. often loses its moral high ground.
Give me an example.
The Cold War context. After the war ended in 1945, the enemy changed almost overnight. It was no longer fascism, it was communism, the Soviet Union. And suddenly, the U.S. needed Japan not as a defeated enemy to be punished, but as a democratic capitalist fortress against the Soviets and communist China.
So what happened to the pursuit of justice? I'm thinking specifically about Unit 731 again.
This is the part that just makes your blood run cold. The U.S. government, through its investigators, discovered the full horrific extent of Unit 731's research. Biological weapons, anthrax, plague, human testing. Instead of prosecuting the unit's commander, Shiro Ishii, and his scientists for war crimes, They cut a deal.
A deal with the devil.
Literally, they granted full secret immunity to Shiro Oishi and his entire team of researchers in exchange for their data, all of it. The U.S. wanted that data on biological warfare to use in its own programs, potentially against the Soviets. So the narrative of justice for all was completely sacrificed for the narrative of Cold War security.
That is a perfect, chilling example of narrative utility. The story changed because the political goal changed. The truth of the atrocities didn't change, but the political usefulness of punishing them just as evaporated.
Precisely. So when you look at this whole triangle, it feels like a total deadlock. China needs the victim story for unity and legitimacy. Japan's conservatives want to be a normal country and move on from the shame. And the U.S. is constantly trying to balance its stated values, democracy and human rights, against its strategic alliance needs.
As one of our sources put it, and I love this line, truth is in the archives, but interpretation is in the mouths of politicians.
And that interpretation is what shapes the world we live in right now. It dictates trade policies, military alliances, and even whether a teenager in Shanghai grows up hating a teenager in Tokyo for something their great-grandparents did.
Okay, so that's the foundation, the ghosts of the past. But ghosts don't just haunt old houses. They haunt new battlefields. I want to fast forward. Let's jump into the time machine.
Buckle up.
It is 2026. Today.
I can literally feel the temperature in this room drop even more.
We are looking at the Russia-Ukraine war. It's now entering its fourth brutal year. And while the fighting is hot drones, artillery, trench warfare, the narrative war is freezing cold and totally calculated.
You know, seeing you in that hoodie today, it really fits the mood. We aren't looking at old black and white photos anymore. We're looking at high-definition live streams of smoking battlefields.
So let's look at the state of play in 2026. Negotiations are happening, or at least they're trying to. Round 3 is coming up in Geneva on February 17th. There's talk of secret back-channel meetings in Abu Dhabi.
But these aren't just talks about where to draw a line on a map. This is cognitive warfare. The battle lines are drawn in the minds of the Russian people, the Ukrainian people, and everyone watching around the world, as much as they are on the ground in the Donbass.
Let's start with Russia's narrative in 2026. It has evolved quite a bit, hasn't it? Back in 2022, it was a special military operation. A very technical, almost sterile term.
Right. In 2022, it was framed as almost clinical. We are going in to fix a specific problem. Now, in February 2026, it's historical revisionism weaponized. Putin frames this as a sacred defense.
There's that WWII link again.
Always. He still uses the term denazification, but now it's about cleaning up unfinished Soviet business. The dominant narrative now is that Russia isn't expanding. It is pushing back existential threats.
This concept of the buffer zone is key now. I've been reading about this buffer zone rhetoric popping up constantly in Russian state media.
It's the new logic for 2026. The argument isn't we want to conquer Ukraine because we are an aggressive empire. The logic is we need a buffer zone to ensure the survival of the Russian state itself against an ever-expanding, aggressive NATO.
So it completely reframes an offensive war of choice into a defensive necessity in the minds of the Russian public.
Exactly. We aren't taking their land. We are creating a shield for our land. It's a powerful psychological shift. It makes the war feel existential for the average person in Moscow or St. Petersburg.
And speaking of the public, that data from Reuters that came out in early 2026 suggests that the Russian public is accepting the idea of the war ending, but with very specific conditions.
Yes, they're tired. The sanctions bite. The casualties are horrifically high. But they accept the war ending if the established goals are met, which basically means the formal annexation of the occupied territories. The narrative has successfully convinced a majority that this land is now, and in fact always was, historically Russian. So if they give it back, it's not a concession for peace. It's a loss of Russian soil.
Now let's flip the coin. Ukraine. Their narrative has been incredibly strong and consistent for 4 years. Mental decolonization.
It's so powerful. It's not just about territory for them. It's about defining the boundary of European democracy. They frame it as a war of anti-colonialism. They are trying to shatter the centuries-old idea that Moscow has any right to define Eastern Europe. They're saying, we are not a wayward province of your empire. We are a sovereign nation that chooses its own destiny in Europe.
But here's the nuance alert for 2026. And this is the really hard part. The reporting we're seeing indicates a subtle but important shift.
It's heartbreaking, but it's also realistic.
Yeah.
The public narrative is slowly shifting from total victory, which means reclaiming every single inch immediately, 1991 borders or bust, to something being called dignified peace.
Dignified peace. What does that actually mean practically? Because to some, that might sound like a euphemism for surrender.
It's a very delicate pivot. If you look at the data from the NYT and CUS, the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, from this year, you see that while 54% of Ukrainians still reject land concessions on principle, the discussion of land for security is no longer taboo. It's being talked about. War fatigue is a real, tangible thing. People are exhausted.
So the narrative goal is shifting from kick them all out right now to something more like secure our sovereignty, join the West, join the EU, maybe NATO, and maybe the final borders is something that gets settled later.
Exactly. The ultimate goal becomes cutting all historical and mental ties with Moscow for good. Even if Russia holds some land militarily, if Ukraine is a thriving, democratic European nation on their border, then Russia has fundamentally lost the narrative war. Russia wanted a puppet state. Instead, they created a permanent fortress of European democracy on their doorstep. That in itself is a form of victory, even if the map isn't perfect right away.
That is a profound reframing. It takes victory out of the hands of just the soldiers and puts it into the hands of society and its future.
But it's an incredibly dangerous political tightrope for President Zelensky to walk.
And where does the U.S. and the rest of the world, especially the global South, fit into this 2026 picture?
The U.S. is completely torn. On one hand, you have the powerful narrative of defending sovereignty, the moral imperative, the idea that we cannot let dictators redraw maps by force. On the other hand, you have the realists in Washington looking at that new CSIS report from 2026.
One about Russian economic resilience. Yeah, I saw that. It was pretty depressing reading.
It was. Despite an estimated 1.2 million casualties and crippling sanctions, the Russian economy hasn't collapsed. It's transformed into a full-blown war economy. They are pumping out tanks and shells. So the U.S. narrative has to balance, we must support Ukraine, with how long can this actually go on? Is this a forever war we're funding?
And the global South. Countries like Brazil, India, South Africa.
They view this largely as victims of great power games. Their narrative isn't about democracy versus autocracy. It's about food security, energy prices, and the cost of fertilizer. They see themselves as the collateral damage in a fight between NATO and Russia. They look at the narrative of defending democracy and say, that's great for you in Washington and Brussels, but my people can't afford bread.
So we have this fundamental conflict of narratives that makes a lasting peace really, really hard to achieve.
That's the crux of it. If Putin admits Ukraine is a real independent nation with its own history and destiny, his entire regime's story, that he is the one restoring Russian greatness collapses. And if Zelensky accepts the buffer zone as a legitimate security concern for Russia, the entire decolonization narrative that has fueled his country's resistance fails.
It's like you said earlier, when war breaks out, the first casualty is truth, the second is complexity.
Everyone simplifies the story to survive. But that very simplification makes ending the war so much harder. How do you compromise with someone your narrative has defined as a Nazi? How do you negotiate with a power you've labeled an existential threat? The narratives trap the leaders.
Okay, we've done the past, we've done the present. Now I want to pull the camera back. We're leaving the muddy trenches of the Eurasian steppes and heading to the open ocean, to the Pacific.
The big one.
The Taiwan Strait. 2026.
This isn't just a will they or won't they scenario anymore. This is arguably the most dangerous geopolitical narrative collision of the 21st century.
We have four main players here: Beijing, Taipei, Washington, and Tokyo. And it feels like they are all running completely different movie scripts at the same time.
All completely different genres even. Beijing is running a historical epic, a destiny story. Taipei is running a futuristic techno-thriller. Washington is running a very complicated legal drama. And Tokyo is running a disaster survival movie.
I love that breakdown. It's perfect. Let's start with Beijing. What is their final judgment narrative?
For the CCP, Taiwan is the final cleanup of WWII anti-fascist history.
Wait, explain that to me. How is Taiwan related to anti-fascism in their view? That seems like a bit of a stretch.
It goes right back to Act 1 that we discussed. Remember the resistance equals rejuvenation narrative. If the CCP is the savior of the Chinese nation and the ultimate victor against Japanese aggression, then recovering Taiwan, which was a Japanese colony from 1895 to 1945, is the final, non-negotiable step of that victory. Until Taiwan is back under their control, the century of humiliation isn't truly over. It's the final chapter of national rejuvenation.
So it's not just about a piece of land. It's about completing their entire national story.
Exactly. And in 2026, we see this playing out in the 15th five-year plan. This is their massive economic and social roadmap for the country. It emphasizes the inevitability of unification. But look at the tactics on the ground or on the water. They are using a strategy of internalization.
Internalization. What does that mean in a practical legal sense?
This is really important for people to understand. They are trying to methodically reframe the Taiwan Strait not as international waters, but as internal Chinese waters. You see the Chinese Coast Guard conducting normalized law enforcement boardings of civilian vessels.
And why the Coast Guard and not the Navy? That seems significant.
It's hugely significant because if you send a Navy destroyer to intercept a ship, that's an act of war. It provokes a U.S. Navy response. But if you send a white-hulled Coast Guard cutter to inspect a cargo ship for contraband or safety violations, it looks like a police action. It's domestic law enforcement.
It's the boiling the frog strategy. You slowly, incrementally normalize your jurisdiction until it's just an accepted fact.
That's exactly it. If Taiwan sends their Navy to stop the Chinese Coast Guard, Taiwan looks like the one escalating the situation. It's a brilliant gray zone tactic that exploits the legal difference between a crime and an act of war. Their goal is to establish the fact of jurisdiction before a single shot is ever fired.
And the psychological war that goes along with that.
It's relentless, spreading U.S. skepticism. The narrative they push constantly into Taiwan's social media is, the U.S. will abandon you, just like they abandoned insert country here. They want to win the war in the minds of the Taiwanese people before the shooting starts. The message is simple. Resistance is futile. Unification is inevitable.
Okay, now let's look at Taiwan. How has their story changed by 2026? Because it feels like they've become much more assertive.
Taiwan has made a conscious shift from the victim pawn narrative to the indispensable cornerstone narrative.
The Silicon Shield.
That and the democratic beacon. They are framing themselves as a global key player, not a local problem. Strategically, some scholars like Song Guocheng call it civilizational containment.
Civilizational containment. Break that down.
Yes. The argument is that Taiwan isn't just an island involved in a Chinese civil dispute. It is the guardian of the entire global order. If Taiwan falls to an authoritarian power, the global order of democracy and free trade falls with it.
And practically, the Silicon Shield refers to their dominance in the semiconductor industry, TSMC.
Right. We're not just talking about a lot of chips. We are talking about over 90% of the world's most advanced chips. The chips in your iPhone, your car, your hospital equipment, your F-35 fighter jet. If Taiwan's chip production goes offline, the global economy crashes instantly. So Taiwan's narrative to the world is, you can't afford to let us fall. The cost is too high for you.
So they're trying to make the cost of losing Taiwan unbearable for the world, not just for themselves. It's a survival strategy.
Precisely. They are raising the stakes of the narrative itself to ensure their physical survival.
Then we have the USA. The narrative here is institutional clarity.
This is a really big shift from the decades-long policy of strategic ambiguity. For so long, the U.S. kept it vague. Maybe we will defend you, maybe we won't.
Yeah.
That was designed to keep China cautious about invading and, frankly, to keep Taiwan from declaring formal independence. But by 2026, we are seeing things like the Taiwan Assurance Implementation Act.
And what does a law like that change that a presidential statement doesn't?
It makes support systematic and predictable. It's not just a verbal promise from one president that can be walked back by the next, it's legislation. And it allows the U.S. to frame the entire issue as international. It frames the conflict around freedom of navigation and international law rather than an internal Chinese affair. It's a direct counter-narrative to Beijing's internalization strategy. It says, no, this is international water and we will sail here.
But here is the big surprise in the 2026 context: Japan.
Japan's shift is by far the most dramatic and, frankly, the most underreported in the West.
We are talking about the survival crisis narrative.
Yes. Under the leadership context, we're seeing potentially referencing the hawkish stances of politicians like Sana Takaichi. Japan is stating clearly that a conflict over Taiwan constitutes a survival crisis situation for Japan itself.
And that's a specific legal term in Japan, isn't it? It's not just rhetoric.
It is. It's a legal trigger in their constitution. It allows for the use of force, what they call collective self-defense, even if Japan itself isn't directly attacked. The narrative is simple. Taiwan emergency equals Japan emergency.
Why? Is it just that of an ideological commitment to democracy in Taiwan?
No, it's cold, hard geography. Let's map it out for now. The southwest islands of Japan, Okinawa, Yonaguni, they trail right down to the coast of Taiwan. The island of Yonaguni is only about 70 miles, 110 kilometers from Taiwan. You can literally see it on a clear day.
And the shipping lanes?
The Bashi Channel. This is the critical stretch of water between Taiwan and the Philippines. This is Japan's economic artery. Japan imports almost all its energy, oil, natural gas. It all comes on tankers from the Middle East, through the Malacca Strait, through the South China Sea, and right through the Bashi Channel.
So if China were to control Taiwan?
They control the Bashi Channel, they can turn off Japan's energy tap, they could choke Japan's economy to a standstill in weeks. So Japan's narrative isn't purely about saving democracy, it's about saving Japan. It's a raw survival narrative.
So everyone has a narrative that justifies escalation. China says, we must complete the nation. Taiwan says we must save the world economy. The U.S. says we must save the international order. And Japan says we must save our own energy lifeline.
It's a four-way game of chicken where everyone is shouting a different existential reason for why they cannot turn the wheel. They've all tied their own hands with their own narratives.
And the reality check, the data, what does the math say?
The math is terrifying. The latest Bloomberg scenario analysis puts the cost of a war over Taiwan at $10 trillion to the global GDP. That would far exceed the economic damage from the Ukraine war or the COVID pandemic combined. It would trigger a global depression instantly.
So the math says don't do it, but the narratives all say we must.
That is the danger zone, when the story becomes more important than the math.
So we've unpacked the past, the present, and the future. And frankly, it feels a bit overwhelming. My coffee is definitely cold now.
It is heavy. It's the kind of stuff that just makes you want to crawl back into bed and pull the covers over your head.
So why do we, as regular people, sip and talkers who just want to drink our coffee or our boba and maybe watch a funny travel vlog, why do we need to know all this? Why shouldn't we just ignore it?
Because if you don't understand the script, my friend, you become an extra in someone else's movie.
And in this movie, the extras don't usually make it to the credits.
That's right. Modern warfare isn't just happening in trenches anymore. It's happening on your phone screen. It's narrative warfare. When you scroll through Twitter or TikTok or whatever platform is dominant in 2026, and you see a video that makes you instantly furious or incredibly proud or deeply scared, that emotion is the ammunition. They're aiming for your feelings.
So what are the takeaways? How do we build that cognitive sovereignty you mentioned?
Okay, 3 things. First, build a mental firewall. When you read a headline that makes you instantly furious or instantly proud, just pause. For 1 second, ask yourself, why am I feeling this? Who wants me to feel this? Is this resistance or aggression? Is this police action or an invasion? You have to identify the framing being used on you.
Okay, mental firewall. Second,
embrace complexity. We have to move beyond black and white thinking. You don't have to agree with Beijing's fear of encirclement or Russia's fear of NATO expansion or Japan's fear of losing its shipping lanes. But you have to understand their survival logic. If you just dismiss them as crazy or evil, you miss the mechanism of the conflict. You can't dismantle a bomb if you don't understand how the wiring works.
And understanding that logic fosters rational discussion. It stops us from just shouting slogans at each other from across the divide.
Exactly. And third, and this is the most practical, survival navigation. These narratives directly affect inflation. They affect global supply chains. They affect your job. If you can spot the trend, if you see the internalization narrative heating up in the Taiwan Strait, maybe you rethink that part of your investment portfolio. Maybe you talk to your boss about your company's supply chain that relies on one single factory in Shenzhen.
It's practical. It's not just abstract philosophy.
It is deeply, deeply practical.
All right, bring us home. Give us that warm close. We definitely need it after that tour of the abyss.
You know, we learn all this not to be cynical. We don't learn it to become paranoid and distrust everyone. We learn it to be resilient. This is Sip and Talk. The whole idea is one sip of coffee, one conversation about truth. And the truth might be cruel, it might be messy, it might be freezing cold like it is in this studio today. But the process of finding it, of thinking for yourself, that is empowering. The world is chaotic, but your heart can be steady.
I love that. The world is chaotic, but your heart can be steady. That's going on a t-shirt.
And your coffee can be hot. Next time, I am bringing a portable space heater. I'm not kidding.
It's a deal. Listeners, remember this. History can be interpreted in a million ways, but the future is written by us. Stay skeptical, stay curious.
And just a quick disclaimer, today's conversation was an objective analysis of international facts and these competing narratives. We aren't endorsing any specific group or expressing hatred toward any people. This show stands for critical thinking and hopefully peaceful dialogue.
Absolutely. Don't forget to hit subscribe on the Sip and Talk podcast. We appreciate every single one of you Sip and Talkers for going on this journey with us.
Indeed. Before we go, you have to check out our old friend Mickey's YouTube channel, Mickey to Life. He has a brand new travel vlog up. I've seen it. It involves a beach, some very questionable dancing, and absolutely zero geopolitical tension. It is vastly more relaxing than today's conversation. Go watch it.
Questionable dancing. I'm in. Do it. We'll see you next time.